Welcome to Say More from Boston Globe Opinion. I'm Anna Kussmer filling in for Jim Dow. On this month's political panel, we're going to dig into the current debate on rent control and Maura Healey's bumpy ride to re-election. But first, we want to discuss a Massachusetts legend and his final words for Democrats. Longtime Congressman Barney Frank died this month of congestive heart failure. But in true Barney style, he went down swinging, sharing tough words for the left and the Democratic Party in general. I'm joined by Abdallah Fayyad and Joan Vennochi from Globe Opinion to discuss Frank's final message. Thanks, both of you, for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Nice to be here.
So, Frank is a liberal icon in the U.S. He was a 16-term congressman from Massachusetts, the district which includes Brookline and Newton. And he basically used his dying words not to yell at Trump, but rather to call out the left, saying Democrats have a, quote, vote-repelling platform. Joan, you covered Frank for much of his career. Did you have any run-ins with him?
Well, I didn't cover him as thoroughly as other people that I've written about, but yeah, it's impossible to cover Barney Frank without having at least one run-in. And the one I recall had to do with a column I wrote. Actually, I just looked it up from 2004, which is a long time ago, in which something about redistricting. And in that column, I interviewed Margaret Heckler, who was a Republican congresswoman who claimed that because of redistricting, she had, lost her seat. I wrote the column. She was on the record, and Barney called and basically yelled at me and told me that I'd gotten it all wrong, and, it was a disaster. And it was a very, really uncomfortable conversation. But I didn't write a correction.
So Frank is known for his brand of long-term strategy, political incrementalism, deal-making. One example is when he was fighting for gay rights, as he did for most of his career, he was careful not to go for marriage equality right away. He started with things like, gays in the military or getting security clearance for people who are openly gay. And he thinks many Democrats are too focused on what he considers fringe-like issues, like letting trans girls play girls' sports, and says Democrats should start smaller with issues that are more popular with the base. And this actually reminds me of the trouble Seth Moulton got in last year when he said something similar, particularly about trans girls playing girls' sports. What do you think of this argument, Abdallah, that the Democrats are not focusing enough on incrementalism, coalition building, and they're maybe being too ambitious with their platforms?
I mean, I think it's a really tricky question, particularly because the Democratic coalition is more fragile than it's ever been, because the Republican Party has really become the party of Trump, and so anti-democratic at its core. The Democrats have to fill a lot of gaps. That means being the party of those former Republicans that don't really have a political home anymore. And they're generally more conservative on economic policy. So the Democrat is trying to court in those voters. At the same time, the Democrat is trying to court, young voters, people on the left, and respond at the same time to Trump's economic populism with their own brand of economic populism. So the Democratic Party coalition, even when you look at demographics like economic or income demographics of voters, more and more college-educated and wealthy suburbanites are Democrats now than they used to be. And if you're going to pass tax policy that, is more worker-friendly and pass economic legislation that's more worker-friendly, that's more aimed at lifting up the poor and the working class, inherently there are going to be divergent interests in the party. It's a tightrope that Democrats have to walk down. And I don't know that they're always doing it successfully, but particularly when it comes to culture, I do think this critique that the party has been hijacked by the left is a little bit overblown, because by and large, Democrats are still voting for Democrats. Mm-hmm. And you have a lot of left-wing politicians that are put in this category, like Zoran Mamdani, that can beat, yes, a scandal plague, but a former governor, almost three-term governor of New York State, for mayor of New York City. So I think a lot of this politics can translate to electability. You just need the right messenger, and you kind of need to be smart about it. But, there's always purity tests. I think there are always purists. That's always existed. But I don't think it's particularly bad now.
I agree with Abdallah. Democrats can get elected running on, I don't say extreme platforms, but a progressive platform like a Mamdani. But then what do you actually accomplish? And I think what Barney Frank was sort of talking about in terms of, particularly from the lawmaking perspective, the old maxim, the perfect is the enemy of the possible.
Mm-hmm.
And do you strive for the possible? I happen to think that is how things get done. And, that may be out of favor right now. And the problem that the Democrats, I think, have right now is not just that they're you might not be able to do that anymore in today's environment because the possible has become the impossible. But the tendency to demonize, which I know is a strong word, but to demonize people who are saying there's a middle here and sort of take that as, well, you're against trans, you're against gay people, you're against this, you're against that, and not see it as a means to an end, the better end. And I think that's what he was kind of stood for and what he was speaking to in that last month of his life.
Abdallah, Barney Frank was famous for being a champion of gay rights in Congress. Do you think it's hypocritical that he's not more sympathetic to the cause of trans civil rights?
I don't know that it's hypocritical because I think Barney Frank was very vocal about LGBT issues broadly. And I think, he often took the stance of, this is what I believe in. I don't think it's possible right now. So we're going to take the more incremental step. I don't know that I would go so far as to call him a hypocrite. I think his main critique is one of strategy. And I think that's a very valid debate to have. But I think my main, disagreement over the strategy is that, sometimes politicians get too bogged down into thinking about what's possible. And I think there is truth to the idea that you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose, as Mario Cuomo used to say. But I think Democrats have just forgotten to campaign in poetry. It's okay. I think voters are okay with watching their lawmakers govern in prose. I think they want more poetry on the campaign trail. And I think that's okay because campaigns and elections are the opportunity for politicians to actually shape public opinion. Like you're fighting for something. So tell us what you're fighting for. You don't have to promise that you're going to do it on day one. I think that's totally fine. But you have to promise us that we're moving towards something. Obamacare is a great example of something that was packaged as something that is incremental. And absolutely, it is incremental. It has fundamentally changed how we as Americans think of healthcare and the government's role in making sure that everybody's covered. Obviously, it's a very far step from Medicare for all or universal coverage, but it helped push that conversation. But what was Obama campaigning on in 2008? He was campaigning on the fundamental message that healthcare is a human right, that this is something that the government has to make sure that everybody has. How we get there doesn't really matter right now, but this is the vision I have. That's campaigning in poetry. And I think that's what Democrats need to do more of. And that's why I brought up Mamdani earlier, too. I think he's really good at that, too. He campaigned in poetry, has a big grand vision for New York. I don't think anybody expects him to transform New York like this. But I do expect that a lot of what he's doing now will be appreciated by a lot of people. Yes, as incremental progress, but there's a vision. Where are we moving towards? I think he's really good at articulating that. So I think that's part of what's missing from the debate here.
So Barney Frank lived his final years in the state of Maine. And in a recent CNN interview right before his death, Jake Tapper asked Frank about why he endorsed Governor Janet Mills over upstart oyster farmer Graham Plattner. And I want to play a clip of what Frank said.
Donald Trump, we originally thought was a joke. And then he turned out to be very good at one thing, exploiting voter discontent. And so he won an election based on that. And since then, It's gone back to being a joke. The man is imploding. He has no program that he's seeking to adopt. I think Plattner actually shared with Trump this capacity for making the most out of the anger that people feel. What I'm afraid of is that you won't be able to translate that into enough votes.
So, Joan, Frank is worried that Plattner is really good at making the most out of people's anger, but it won't be able to translate to legislating, essentially. I'm curious what you think of this.
Well, I agree that he's tapped into anger, and I guess there's a Trump-like quality to that. Plattner still hasn't actually won the Senate seat, so the first thing he has to do is, marshal the anger, get enough people to vote to beat Susan Collins. And the polls are showing him ahead, I believe. He's under pretty heavy attack right now. I don't think it's going to be as easy as it was getting Janet Mills out of the way. But I do think that when he gets there, it's going to be really, really hard to achieve some of the things that he's kind of promising right now. And I understand the need for poetry. I understand, the mission and the goals, and the Democrats have to lay out exactly what they stand for and where they want to get. But there have been some really powerful speakers and advocates for what Plattner is taking up right now. Bernie Sanders, for one, Elizabeth Warren for another. And, to get to that point where you've got a critical mass of people in Congress that are going to make that happen. I don't want to be cynical, but it's just so hard. It's sad that it is, but it's just really hard.
But I think, isn't that part of it is, obviously no one expects Plattner to get elected in Maine and then change the country.
Some people do.
Maybe so, but he's one of 100 in the Senate. He's one of 535 members in Congress overall. He's not even running for president. You won't have any kind of authority there. By design, he's going to have to build a coalition. And we see this happen in Congress maybe less often than used to be. But, if you want to pass something, you're going to have to work with people who disagree with you. And I think that's perfectly legitimate. I think that's a perfectly...
that's how Obamacare
right.
came to be. John McCain and Ted Kennedy.
Right, exactly.
Reaching across the aisle.
Yeah. And I think that's part of the appeal here, for Plattner's base is they're sending somebody, or they're trying to send somebody to Congress who is more like Bernie Sanders, more like Elizabeth Warren, and that type. And they are trying to increase their critical mass. That doesn't mean that they expect the economy to fundamentally change just because Plattner was elected, but it means that he's telling people, this is where I'd like to go. And then it is his job to try to get as close to that as possible. If that means compromising and passing bipartisan measures that helps you get there, infrastructure bills that invest in fisheries, and farms and things like that, I think he can go back to his constituents and say that he's starting to deliver on some of those things. But I don't think that means when he's campaigning, he should say like, oh, I don't think this is possible. So, here's a half-measured approach to how we can get there. I think that would
not be successful campaign strategy.
And so I think that's the.
But I'd like to hear a little bit more about when he got there, what he would actually do.
Yeah.
How would he do? Who would he reach across the aisle to? Who does he see as a possible ally? I mean,
those are good questions. I agree. Yeah.
More of our political panel after a short break. I want to go now to the question of rent control, which you have both written about recently. Abdallah, you wrote that you are generally pro-rent control, but you are not in favor of a proposed initiative in Massachusetts right now. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think the housing crisis, not just in Massachusetts, but across the country, requires all kinds of solutions. I don't think it's just a supply issue. I also think there's a demand issue. And I think that means you attack the problem with both supply side policies like building more housing and also demand side policies on regulating prices. Rent control is just one tool that lawmakers shouldn't keep off the table. The problem with this ballot question in particular is that it is essentially introducing what would be the strictest rent control policy nationwide. It is capping annual rent increases at inflation or a maximum of 5%. So if you break down what that means if you have an apartment anywhere in Massachusetts and this passes, rent will never actually increase in real dollar values. It can only decrease in real dollar terms. Because if inflation is over 5%, landlords won't be able to match it, which means that rent actually relatively would decline for you, even if the dollar figure is not down. It's just because of inflation. And that is so strict, that it's bound to fail, I think, as a policy in Massachusetts, because it leaves very little room for landlords to, make money, when the economy is doing better, for developers to have incentive, I think, to build. I think there are all these problems with it. It's not well considered. And I think, this is Beacon Hill's problem, and they should address it, in the legislature, not at the ballot box.
Joan, you wrote about how developers are basically saying we will not be able to get bank financing for our proposed projects if this ballot measure passes. Do you think that's actually true, or do you think this is a way to manipulate public opinion before elections in November?
Well, first, on the overall question, I'd say what he said, what Abdallah said. And I think a big problem with this ballot question is that it mandates for every city and town in Massachusetts. If it was a local option scenario where, Cambridge could decide that they wanted this, that would make some sense. But to across the board, mandate it, I just think that's bad. As far as, sympathy for the developer, well, I talked to the CEO of Cabot and Forbes, and he was very convincing in showing me how the numbers work and how hard it is to make money as a developer, and how just the thought of this option is chilled financing. And it is hard to buy into that. You just want to say, well, couldn't you make just a little bit less money? And he had a whole long answer to that I didn't entirely understand. But what Abdallah said, that essentially it's freezing rent at a certain level. It is true that who's going to give money if they already know that on the other side of it, it's not going to be generating, more as much revenue as they want. So I do think there are legitimate reason for concern. I will throw out one other thing. I'm sure no one here watches regular television like I do, but they're running ads right now that are really scary, which make me want to vote for the rent control ballot question.
A ballot question on rent control? Here are the facts. It imposes a rent mandate on every city and town, with no exceptions. Studies show prices could go up for most renters. The housing supply decreases, and finding a place to live gets even harder.
It's the whispery voice, and it's just really, really sort of try to scare people into voting against it. And I just kind of wonder about that as a tactic. They probably have done focus groups, and it probably works, but my instinct is to not support it. But when I see the ad, I think, I wonder.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's true. I mean, the majority of Massachusetts voters support rent control. I think they would support this ballot measure. If it gets on the ballot and everything is finalized, I think it's on its way to passing. But I think it's a loss either way. If the opposition campaign succeeds with this fear-mongering campaign, then rent control fails, and the Beacon Hill lawmakers will say, hey, see, we put it to the voters and they don't want rent control again, just like when the prohibition on rent control came along in the 90s by ballot measure. And lawmakers have used that as an excuse ever since, as voters don't want this. There was a referendum. Voters don't want this.
Right. They wouldn't even let Michelle Wu
exactly
to have the local option to do it when she went to the legislature. So they're just cowardly.
Yeah.
Abdallah, in your piece, you argue that this shouldn't even be a ballot measure. Rent control should not be a ballot measure. This should be like a legislative solution. Can you discuss a little bit more the difference there and what you would like to see?
The reason I think a legislative fix is better is because, as proposed, this ballot question is just across the board. Like Joan mentioned, this is across the board for every city and town in Massachusetts, which means that rent control would just become the law of the state, and there's no way to opt out of it. I think a much better route, which could have also been a ballot measure, actually, is if it was just to end the prohibition on rent control. So that if cities and towns want to impose their own form of rent control, as Mayor Michelle Wu proposed in Boston, they can do that for their jurisdictions. But a policy that makes sense in Boston doesn't, necessarily make sense, in Western Massachusetts. So I think cities and towns should have the right to design their own policy when it comes to rent control. And I think, there can be a lot of debate there as to, what's good policy. But when you're designing this, I think it has to be tailored to the town. You need lawmakers involved. And it's a better fix, a legislative fix than something broad-based across the board. And the only form that would have worked as a ballot measure is to just end the rent control prohibition, the ban on rent control statewide, and then give lawmakers at the local level the ability to design their own policies.
Do you think that ballot measures are sometimes like kind of stand-ins for an indictment of the legislative process? Like it's when citizen groups just say, hey, we're tired of the legislature not fixing a problem that we all agree is here. And then we get into the situation where we have like an imperfect ballot measure that our legislators should have been kind of on this problem this whole time, and they haven't been solving it.
Right. They in the case of rent control, the lawmakers have just been, kicking the can down the road and just refusing to take it up. We have that, the other example in Massachusetts right now is the ballot question that passed, we don't want to get into all the grisly details, but whether or not the auditor could audit, the House and Senate, the legislature. That's kind of a proxy for people feeling that there's a complete lack of transparency in how government operates in Massachusetts, and it's become this cause célèbre when actually the legislature could address it just by saying, "Hey, here are our books. Just take a look. It's all here. You don't need a ballot question to to have somebody look into it." I think it's frustration with the way Beacon Hill is working.
Just for our own edification, Abdallah, are there other states or cities that you think have the best rent control that, you'd like to see Massachusetts follow more in that direction?
Yeah, I think there are plenty of examples that Massachusetts could follow, but specifically cities and towns like Boston or Cambridge could take into account. And one great example of a rent stabilization policy that has largely worked is in Washington, D.C. The policy in D.C. is designed to cap rent increases at inflation plus 2%, a maximum of 10% when inflation is really high, and a maximum of 5% for seniors and people with disabilities. So when times are good, that means that landlords can still increase the rent, not just inflation, but an additional 2%, which means that their net income would increase. It also has specific carve-outs for, repairs that you can raise the rents, if you're going to renovate your building and make sure that there's upkeep. So I think there are definitely models and jurisdictions that, Boston can look to, that Massachusetts can look to, of rent control policies that work. And I think that's the problem that lawmakers have ignored for so long and why we're at this juncture to begin with, which is that Beacon Hill has continued to say no to rent control just because of the ballot measure in the 90s. And it's that this is what voters want. But there has been no appetite to really deal with the housing crisis from the demand side at the legislature. And I think that's why, voters are taking it into their own hands. And I think, obviously they have the right to do that. And so, that's where we're headed.
I want to end our conversation today talking about Governor Maura Healey. She maintains a comfortable double-digit lead against her Republican challengers, but her personal approval ratings are struggling, and I think they're the lowest they've been. And the number one issue that people have is the high cost of living. Joan, what are you hearing from voters and strategists about people's frustrations with the governor?
Well, I think the frustration with Maura Healey is interesting because she's trying to do a version of what Charlie Baker did. And he was the most popular governor in America, supposedly, and very popular here in Massachusetts. And he was doing what they called in the Clinton years triangulating, finding the middle. And I think Healey has been trying to do that. And in these times, the middle just isn't where people want you to be. You're displeasing the conservatives. You're displeasing the liberals. People want you to stand for something, as we were talking about earlier. So I think that kind of seeps into the likability factor. She's had some tough issues to deal with too. The migrant crisis, the fight with the Trump administration, cutting of federal funding. They're just tough issues. And she honestly doesn't look like she's having that good of a time dealing with them. And I think some of that, sort of seeps into people's perception of her.
Abdallah, do you think that she would benefit from playing less to the middle, or do you think that's sort of an obvious strategy in a place like Massachusetts?
That's a good question. I think, what really drags any incumbent is I think the cost of living. So I think no matter what she does, even if she is bolder and more ambitious, and passes all my dream lefty legislation, I don't think that's going to solve her political problems in the near term, because when it comes to an intractable crisis like the housing crisis, you're not going to see results for years down the road, and people are still going to be paying rent every month. And I think, given how high the cost of living is, any incumbent governor right now would suffer from lower approval ratings. I also think you can't, overinterpret these numbers, or you shouldn't overinterpret these numbers, because, she's cruising to reelection. Unfortunately, this is a symptom of how uncompetitive elections are in Massachusetts. But it's not really counting as political baggage for her, at least in the near term. Maybe she has presidential ambitions later on. Who knows? But for now, I don't think it's going to really impact her governance.
I agree with that. I think an interesting sort of sidelight into what's happening in Massachusetts is both parties are really losing registered members. Republicans are down to, I think, maybe 11%. Democrats, I'm forgetting the percentage, but the big number is the independents. So I think it's a little bit harder to figure out where that big group of people actually is on a lot of issues.
I mean, we're historically the state, we're the liberal state with the popular Republican governors. We're the land of Mitt Romney and Charlie Baker. Do you think that era of sort of popular Republicans is over in Massachusetts?
Well, once the MAGA movement drove the Mitt Romneys and the Charlie Bakers out of the party, it left it with the extremes. And on social issues, there's no way that I don't see any way that Massachusetts voters would ever, vote for somebody that represents those extremes on social issues. But the independent base might be a little bit more fiscally conservative and looking, again, with the legislature, sort of running amok and sort of being seen as this sort of secretive entity, the push for more transparency, that could push people for saying, look at, the Democrats are basically in power. We're looking for a new leader and a new vision for how we want to get out of this.
What do you think Massachusetts as a state loses when we don't have a good kind of competitive governor race? I mean, do you think that might make the current governor, more complacent, less bold if they don't have like a serious kind of legitimate challenger from the right?
I mean, I think we miss a real debate.
I think it's just bad for democracy. It's bad for holding elected officials accountable. Ultimately, elections are about accountability. And if you can, just cruise to re-election, even if you're doing things that people aren't happy with, I think democracy is really not functioning the way it should. I think a big part of it is that the Republican Party is too homogenous, and it has been turned into a party solely about Trump and his petty grievances. And that just doesn't work in Massachusetts. And if the GOP wants to be competitive here, they just have to not take their cues from the national party. And obviously it's hard to do that. But yeah, I think ultimately that's bad. Where we are right now, the lack of competition is really bad for democracy.
Abdallah Fayyad is a writer for Globe Ideas. Joan Vennochi is a columnist for Globe Opinion. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Say More is a production of the Boston Globe. Today's episode was produced by me. Our editor is Jim Dow. Our engineer is Uzair Ahmed. If you like the show, please follow us and leave a review. You can email us at saymore@globe.com. I'm Anna Kussmer. Thanks for listening.